In this episode, we move to one of the most practical questions in responsible artificial intelligence, AI governance. Before an organization deploys a system, how does it decide whether the surrounding environment is actually ready for that system to succeed without creating avoidable harm? Many beginners assume deployment readiness is mostly a technical judgment about whether the model works well enough on a test set or performs smoothly in a pilot. That matters, but it is only one piece of the puzzle, because a system that looks impressive in development can still fail once it meets real users, real constraints, messy data, unclear goals, and teams that were never prepared to work with it properly. A mature organization therefore evaluates the whole setting around the system, including the deployment context, the business goals driving adoption, the ethical issues raised by the use case, the quality and suitability of the data, and the readiness of the workforce expected to rely on or supervise the system. The central lesson is simple but powerful. Responsible deployment is not just about whether the technology is capable, but whether the organization is prepared to use that capability wisely. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good place to begin is the deployment context, because the meaning of an AI system changes depending on where it will be used, who will use it, who may be affected by it, and how much influence it will have over real decisions or real work. Deployment context includes the seriousness of the task, the surrounding workflow, the pace at which decisions must be made, the availability of human review, the type of users involved, and the kinds of mistakes that would matter most if the system performed poorly. The same technical system may be relatively low risk in one setting and deeply sensitive in another, even if the model itself has not changed at all. A writing assistant used to draft internal meeting summaries is very different from a system that helps prioritize healthcare cases, screen job applicants, or flag people for extra scrutiny in a public service setting. For a beginner, this is one of the biggest mindset shifts in AI governance, because it shows that risk is not stored inside the model alone, but emerges from the relationship between the model and the environment into which it is deployed. Once you understand deployment context, it becomes easier to see why organizations cannot evaluate readiness in the abstract. They need to ask concrete questions about the real setting in which the system will operate. Will the users be experts who can recognize weak outputs, or general staff who may overtrust a polished response? Will the system support a reversible decision, or will it influence an outcome that is hard to undo after the fact? Will people affected by the system even know that AI is involved? And will they have any recourse if something goes wrong? These questions matter because context determines not only the level of risk, but also the kinds of safeguards that need to surround the deployment. Beginners should remember that a technically accurate system can still be poorly deployed if the operating environment makes its mistakes too costly, its limitations too hard to notice, or its outputs too likely to be accepted without meaningful challenge. Business goals are the next major part of the readiness picture, because every deployment should be tied to a clear reason for existing. Organizations sometimes become excited about AI simply because it sounds modern, efficient, or competitive, and that excitement can lead them to deploy systems before they have defined what real problem they are solving. A strong evaluation asks what the organization is trying to accomplish, why AI is an appropriate tool for that purpose, how success will be judged, and whether the expected benefit is large enough to justify the additional risk, cost, and oversight burden the system may introduce. If the goal is vague, shifting, or mostly symbolic, the project is already on weak ground because there is no clear standard for deciding whether the deployment is worthwhile or even necessary. For a beginner, the key lesson is that business goals are not just about growth or efficiency. They are part of governance because they help determine whether the system has a defensible purpose and whether the organization is being disciplined or merely following hype. Clear business goals also help organizations avoid a common failure mode, which is using AI to accelerate a process that was poorly designed to begin with. Speed and scale can sound attractive, but if the underlying workflow is confusing, unfair, or badly governed, automation may simply make those weaknesses happen faster and at greater volume. That is why leaders should ask whether the deployment improves the quality of the work, the consistency of the process, or the experience of the people affected by it, rather than assuming that faster output always means better outcomes. A system that saves labor but increases confusion, complaint volume, unfair treatment, or downstream correction costs may not actually advance the business goal it was meant to serve. Beginners should pay attention to this because governance is not impressed by technological motion for its own sake. It asks whether the system makes the organization better at achieving a legitimate objective in a way that remains proportionate, manageable, and accountable once the system is active in the real world. Ethics enters the conversation at this point because organizations are not evaluating a machine in a vacuum. They are deciding whether to place that machine into relationships, decisions, and services that can affect human beings in meaningful ways. Ethical evaluation asks whether the deployment respects fairness, avoids unnecessary harm, preserves appropriate human judgment, supports transparency, and treats affected people with dignity rather than as mere inputs to an efficiency project. For a beginner, ethics can sound abstract until you remember that AI systems may shape who gets attention, who gets delayed, who gets rejected, who gets escalated, who gets more scrutiny, or who receives a poorer experience because of assumptions embedded in data and design. Those effects are not separate from the business case. They are part of whether the system deserves to be deployed at all. Ethical evaluation, therefore, helps the organization examine whether the proposed use is merely legal or technically feasible, or whether it is also responsible when viewed from the standpoint of the people living with its consequences. A practical ethics review usually asks whether the system may disadvantage certain groups, whether its outputs can be meaningfully challenged, whether users will understand the role of automation, and whether the deployment could pressure people into accepting machine-generated judgments they cannot realistically question. It also asks whether the organization has created a fair balance between efficiency and human protection. Sometimes the most important ethical issue is not bias in the narrow sense, but over-reliance, opacity, loss of recourse, or the quiet removal of human attention from situations that still require judgment and empathy. Beginners often assume ethics is a final layer added after the technical work is done, but in reality, ethics should shape the deployment decision itself by clarifying which uses are too sensitive, which need stronger safeguards, and which may be acceptable only under narrow conditions. That is why ethical evaluation belongs beside business and operational review rather than being treated as a separate moral conversation that can be postponed until after deployment pressure has already taken control. Data readiness is another major part of evaluating whether deployment should move forward, because an AI system is only as reliable as the information shaping its behavior and supporting its operation. Before deployment, the organization should understand what data the system was trained on or configured around, what live data it will receive, how representative that data is of real-world conditions, how current it is, how complete it is, and what quality problems may already be present before the first real user ever touches the system. Data may be technically available and still be unfit for the task if it is outdated, biased, too narrow, poorly labeled, or disconnected from the people and situations the deployment is supposed to address. For beginners, the important point is that data readiness is not about having a large pile of information. It is about whether the available information is suitable, defensible, and operationally aligned with the actual use case. Weak data can make even a promising model appear confident while quietly making poor judgments based on a distorted picture of reality. Organizations also need to think carefully about whether the production data environment is stable enough to support the deployment over time. A system may look strong during evaluation and still enter a workflow where live inputs are incomplete, messy, delayed, inconsistent, or significantly different from the patterns seen during testing. If important context never reaches the system, the outputs may be weaker than leaders expect, and the users around the system may not realize why quality is falling. Data readiness, therefore, includes checking pipelines, access assumptions, permissions, update practices, validation procedures, and the possibility that key variables may change once the system is exposed to actual operations. For a beginner, This matters because many AI failures are not caused by a brilliant model suddenly becoming foolish. They are caused by ordinary weaknesses in the surrounding data environment that were underestimated because teams focused too heavily on model development and not enough on the conditions under which the system would have to function every day after deployment. Workforce readiness is just as important as data readiness, even though it receives far less attention in many deployments. A system can be technically sound and ethically reviewed and still fail because the people expected to use it or supervise it were never prepared to do so responsibly. Workforce readiness means the organization has considered who will rely on the outputs, who will review doubtful cases, who will handle escalations, who will maintain the system, and whether all of those people understand the tool well enough to use it without blind trust or confused avoidance. Training matters, but so do workload, incentives, authority, and clarity of role. If staff are told to use the system but are given little time to challenge it, little guidance on its limitations, or no meaningful ability to override it, then the organization may claim human oversight while creating conditions where real oversight is nearly impossible. Beginners should understand that governance is weakened whenever human supervision exists only on paper and not in the day-to-day reality of work. That is why workforce readiness must include operational realism. Leaders should ask whether users know what the system is good at, what it is bad at, and what signs suggest an output should not be trusted. They should ask whether managers are likely to pressure employees to defer to the system because it is faster, more scalable, or easier to defend than individual judgment. They should ask whether training is a one-time event or part of an ongoing support process that evolves as the system changes and as new risks are observed. For beginners, this is one of the clearest ways to connect governance to ordinary organizational life. If the workforce does not understand the system, does not have time to review it, or does not feel empowered to challenge it, then deployment readiness is weaker than the technical documentation may suggest. A responsible organization prepares people not just to operate the tool, but to question it, escalate concerns, and recognize when the system is being used outside the boundaries that originally made it acceptable. Another important point is that these areas do not stand alone. Deployment context, business goals, ethics, data, and workforce readiness interact constantly, and a weakness in one area can undermine the others. A strong business goal cannot rescue a deployment with poor data. Good data cannot justify a use case that places too much authority in a setting where ethical risks are severe. Ethical safeguards may look good on paper and still fail if the workforce lacks training, time, or escalation authority. Context may appear manageable until leaders realize the deployment will be used under pressure, at high volume, and by staff who were not involved in its design. For a beginner, this connected view is essential because it prevents a box-checking mindset. Deployment evaluation is not about collecting enough separate approvals. It is about judging whether the whole socio-technical arrangement makes sense as a defensible, workable, and proportionate way to bring the AI system into real use. A simple example helps tie these ideas together. Imagine an organization wants to deploy an AI assistant to help review customer support messages and suggest next actions to staff. The deployment context may seem moderate at first, but a closer look might reveal that some cases involve financial hardship, service denial, or sensitive personal information, which raises the stakes. The business goal may be faster response times, but leaders still need to ask whether speed is the right objective if weaker recommendations create more rework or worse customer treatment later. Ethics review may reveal concerns about inconsistent outcomes, loss of empathy, or weak transparency when customers do not realize automation shaped the interaction. Data review may show that past cases reflect uneven documentation practices or outdated policy language. Workforce review may show that agents are already overloaded and may accept suggested answers too quickly to apply meaningful judgment. For beginners, the lesson is that readiness becomes visible only when the organization looks at the whole setting instead of admiring the tool in isolation. There are several misconceptions that can make this kind of evaluation weaker than it should be. One is the belief that if the model is accurate enough, the organization is ready enough. Another is the idea that strong business value cancels out ethical concerns, as though efficiency can simply outweigh fairness, clarity, or recourse. A third is the assumption that workforce readiness can be solved by a short training session shortly before launch. A fourth is the belief that data problems can be fixed later without much effect on the initial deployment decision. These ideas are all dangerous because they encourage shallow approval of systems whose surrounding environment is not actually prepared for responsible use. Beginners should build a habit of asking a broader question. If this system were deployed tomorrow into the real workflow, with the real users, real data, and real pressures that exist now, would the organization honestly be able to explain why that decision was responsible? If the answer is weak, readiness is weak no matter how polished the demonstration may look. As we close, the central lesson is that evaluating a proposed deployment means evaluating far more than the model itself. The organization has to understand the real context in which the system will operate, the business goal that is supposed to justify the effort, the ethical concerns created by the use case, the readiness and suitability of the data environment, and the preparedness of the workforce expected to use and supervise the tool. These factors combine to determine whether the deployment is proportionate, understandable, controllable, and worth the risks it may introduce. For a new learner, that broader view is one of the most important transitions from technical thinking to governance thinking. Responsible organizations do not ask only whether the AI can be deployed. They ask whether the setting around it is ready, whether the purpose is legitimate, whether the people affected by it are being treated fairly, and whether the humans responsible for the system are truly prepared to keep it within defensible boundaries after it goes live.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.